MedicusPodden.
Nå du endelig gravid.
Varierer veldig fra par til par.
Takk for besøket.
Velkommen til MedicusPodden.
Velkommen til MedicusPodden, en podcast om fertilitet og kvinnehelse. Jeg heter Mari Fevåg Heger og jobber som fertilitetscoach på Medicus. Jeg forfatter av boka Drømmen om barn, og har også min egen Instagram-konto med ukentlig innhold på tema fertilitet, IVF og barneønske. I tillegg har Medicus sin egen Instagram-konto som det verdt å følge. Vi vil gjerne at du gir oss tilbakemelding på om det noen spesielle tema som du ønsker at vi skal ta opp i podcasten. For denne podcasten, den for dere.
Velkommen til MedicusPodden.
Hei til deg som lytter på MedicusPodden, og velkommen til dagens episode, folkens. Nå når jeg sitter og spiller inn den her, så skinner sola gjennom vinduet og inn i stua mi. Og det så fint vær ut. Det gir jo en god følelse, og det gjør jo at man kjenner litt på håp. Den følelsen, den liker jeg altså. Det må jeg si. Og den følelsen har jeg litt for også den episoden som dere skal få høre nå. Jeg gleder meg skikkelig til å dele denne episoden med dere. Fordi jeg tror det har så stor verdi for par og single i behandling å få innsikt, bli kjent med og få vite mer om hva som skjer inne på laben. Så i dagens episode så håper jeg at du også sitter igjen med den samme gode følelsen som jeg hadde både under innspilling og også etter innspillinga. Både med følelsen av å ha mer innsikt, kjenne på at du har litt mer kunnskap, men også kunne sitte og lytte til den nære og fine praten Steven og jeg fikk. Steven embryolog hos oss på Medicus i Oslo, og han så dedikert og veldig dyktig i jobben sin som embryolog. Han har et høyt kunnskapsnivå som jeg har lært mye av opp gjennom årene. Og han bryr seg så mye. Og det kanskje det fineste med Steven også, at han bryr seg så genuint om de parene og den single kvinnen som han hjelper på veien mot det å få barn. Så når vi sitter og snakker i dag, så det ved flere anledninger at jeg blir rørt av å høre hans holdninger inn i jobben, og hvordan han opplever det her fra sitt ståsted, og hvordan han har følelser knyttet til jobben sin i forbindelse med parene og de single han møter. Så jeg gleder meg nå, vi skal komme i gang veldig, veldig raskt. Men bare sånn, for å sette oss litt i sånn stemning da, så husker den dag i dag fortsatt den følelsen jeg hadde etter egguttak. Hvor det mest dyrebare jeg hadde, det jeg brydde meg aller mest om, lå i noen andres hender. Jeg tenkte på de embryoene hele tiden, og jeg var så redd for å miste dem. De embryoene var jo min mulighet til å kunne oppleve å bli mamma og bli gravid og få barn. Så det betydde så enormt mye, og det her vet jo embryologene. Og de vet hvor mye det betyr, så det klart at de kjenner jo på det her i jobben sin, og derfor så det så fantastisk å få lov til å komme litt på innsida hos embryologene for å faktisk få den følelsen av at de genuint opptatt av at dere skal lykkes. Så da har jeg bare lyst til å ønske deg god lytting. Over til dagens episode, som jeg har, som dere vet, gledet meg masse til, fordi labben for veldig mange veldig hellig. Det mye som skjer innpå der som ikke mange vet så mye om, men det fryktelig mange som har masse spørsmål rundt det som foregår på lab. Og det jo sånn at man har sitt mest verdifulle inne på labben. Og så da jeg så glad for at min kjære kollega, som jeg har jobbet med i ganske mange år, Steven hadde lyst til å stille opp og svare på mange av de spørsmålene som dere lurer på. Og i dag så har jeg ganske mange spørsmål til deg, Steven, men aller først velkommen til episoden.
Thank you very much. Really
Ja.
glad to be here. It's exciting.
Ja, det er veldig, veldig hyggelig å ha deg med også, og sånn som dere kanskje hører nå, så blir vi talende både norsk og engelsk. Steven forstår veldig godt min trøndersk norsk godt,
Yep.
og jeg forstår også engelsk, så det tror jeg skal gå ganske greit, og det er jo også en måte å vise på at selv om du snakker engelsk, så kan også pasientene snakke norsk til deg. Det forstår du jo.
Mm.
Så for at vi skal starte episoden her nå, så tenker jeg at det er veldig fint for dem som lytter til episoden og hører litt hvem du er, Steven.
All right.
Så hvis du har lyst til å fortelle litt hvem du er, jeg kjenner deg jo godt, men din bakgrunn og hva du synes er fint med å jobbe på Medicus.
Yeah, absolutely. So, as you, Mari has said, I'm not Norwegian. I actually grew up in Southern Africa, Botswana and South Africa, before moving to Scotland, where I did my education there. So I got my education in reproductive medicine, looking mainly at male factor infertility, and then I was very fortunate to get a position at the University of California, Berkeley, as a postdoc. So I did quite a lot of research into male factor infertility, and really opened my eyes to different aspects of fertility and fertility treatment, which I kind of take on with my job at the moment. After that, I kind of decided that research maybe wasn't for me, and I wanted to do something that I could actually help people on the ground, sort of face to face. So I had a wild idea to apply for jobs in Scandinavia, and I was very lucky to get my first choice at Medicus. So I started at Medicus Trondheim, where I was there for 2 years. That's where Mari and I worked together. We had a lot of fun together.
Det var gode tider, Steven.
Yeah. A-team, definitely the A-team.
Ja.
So after that, I moved to Oslo, where we opened our new clinic there in 2019. And I've been the lab manager at Medicus Oslo since then. So currently I'm working in Oslo with a fantastic team of 5 embryologists. And that's what I'm currently doing at the moment.
Hva er det som gjør at, for du sier jo litt om det nå også, og du har jo sagt til meg, og jeg har jo sett hvor dedikert og glad du på en måte er i den jobben. Hva er det som gjør at du elsker å jobbe som embryolog med å hjelpe både single og par da, til å få barn og bli en familie?
Yeah, I think there's so many things that are really exciting about this job, and also I think being a part of people's journey when they're coming for this sort of treatment. Every day is different, every person is different, and we have to adapt ourselves to help those people in the best possible way. I love having a full story. So when a person comes in for their egg collection, meeting those people, helping them along the way, hopefully giving them good news, and then finally getting a positive pregnancy result at the end of it after all the hard work. And I mean, the icing on the cake is when people come in with the children that you've created. That is the most wonderful gift to any embryologist. And that's kind of why I love this job so much.
Det blir jo veldig ekte.
Yeah,
It's
fantastic.
Jeg får litt, ja, det er helt enig, selv om jeg på en måte ikke har en sånn fysisk berøring på noe av resultatet i behandlingen til noen par eller single, så er jeg i hvert fall i berøringen på følelsene og veien mot det, og det er jo fantastisk. Det er jo fantastisk.
And it's such an honor as an embryologist as well to be part of this part of the journey with people.
Yeah.
So to have people trust you with the most precious thing in their life, it's a fantastic experience.
Ja, det er fantastisk. Det er ikke så mye mer å si, egentlig, rett og slett. Litt sånn før vi går til faget ditt og på en måte livet inne på labben.
Ja.
Du har jo nevnt, sånn at jeg får nesten frysninger på meg på hvorfor du liker jobben og hva som er bra med det. Men det er jo nok også sikkert noe som er vanskelig eller mer krevende med å være embryolog òg.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's always the obvious thing of giving people bad news. No one wants bad news, and that's very disheartening for embryologists as well as the people that are coming in to get help. I think that is probably one of the worst things, to prepare yourself for a phone call of maybe a failed fertilization or embryos not getting to the right stage. That is so difficult because you always want to think, what could I have done better to help in this situation? And
Som
sometimes,
embryolog?
yeah, as an embryologist, I mean, it's the reason why we do this is we want the best possible outcome. To give a phone call to a couple that maybe aren't having the best cycle is very difficult. There's also other things. For example, as an embryologist, it's kind of like self-sacrifice as well. Biology does not stop for anyone. So embryologists work very long hours. We work weekends, we work holidays sometimes. It's about dedication to what we do and to people that need our help. So that can be quite tough at times.
Ja. Det vet jeg jo at det er, og det er veldig forståelig også. For den dedikasjonen dere har, og jeg vil jo også kreve mye av dere. Så det går jo utover andre ting også kan gjøre.
Yeah, absolutely. I think as well, with just speaking to my team, when we do get these bad cases, it's almost like we're very protective, like they're our embryos as well. So we feel that we've done something wrong and we haven't given the best possible outcome. So it can be quite difficult when we see that.
Det er vel noe som er viktig at dere også får prata om, sånn at man ikke kjenner på en guilt eller en skyldfølelse overfor noe som dere egentlig ikke kan ha gjort noe annerledes, eller?
No, but it is being a part of the sort of situation. It's making sure that you do the best at every possible point in the time that those embryos, eggs and sperm are with you in the lab, so that you can give a good outcome. And also trying to just, it's very difficult not to attach yourself emotionally to people.
Yep, I know.
Yeah, it's really difficult. And when you get these lovely people that are coming in who are so desperate for help, you want to pour your heart and soul into everything you do. So that can be quite challenging when it's not a favorable outcome.
Ja, det er veldig forståelig. Det her er jo ytterpunkter, både av hvorfor man gjør det, og på en måte baksida når det ikke går sånn som du, eller gjengen på lab, oss på Medicus og pasientene ønsker. Så er jo det her ytterpunktene, og så er det jo veldig mye mellom her, som dere gjør hver dag. Og du skal slippe å på en måte ta oss gjennom detaljnivå, men så når du går på jobb på Medicus, og så går du inn på labben, hvordan ser en dag ut for deg på lab? Hva er det du gjør?
Yeah. So, I mean, one of the first things that we do in the lab is we check to make sure that the eggs from the day before have fertilized. So usually that can be any time in the morning between 6:30 to 8. So we do have an early start.
Yeah.
And then from that, it's calling patients, grading the embryos. If there's cycles that require thawing of embryos, that will happen. And then freezing of embryos. And then we get on to the sort of main part of the day, which is the egg collection and the sperm preparation. That will take a good couple of hours, depending on how busy the day is. After that, then comes the sort of main part, putting the sperm and the eggs together. And depending on the type of treatment, if it's, for example, ICSI, where we take the sperm and put it into the egg, that will be done roughly 4 hours after the egg collection. And we actually sit down, we prepare the eggs, and then we select sperm and inject it in before putting those eggs back into the incubator for overnight culture. For IVF, we would take the sperm and the eggs, put them in the dish, and then leave them overnight.
Yeah.
After that, that's the sort of main part. Then we have the exciting part of transfers, which is always the best part, I feel.
Yeah.
When you're handing back these precious embryos. That will happen after lunch, and we go through that. So once we've got through that part of the day, then it's planning for the next day. So this is the dish preparation, ID checks, checking journals, getting everything organized. And finally, it's cleaning the lab, getting everything organized in that part. And then sometimes you'll finish at maybe 4 o'clock, 5 o'clock, depending on how busy the day is. So it is a very intensive day. There's not really a dull moment. So you always have to be on top of everything. Lots of focus.
Det jo veldig interessant for oss som på en måte ikke kjent med en sånn type jobbhverdag. For det jo veldig interessant fagfelt. Det jo det. Så det skal vi jo komme tilbake til. Men klarer du på en måte når du har på en måte billedgjort en dag for deg på labben, da, på jobb, klarer du på en måte å skille ut hva egentlig den viktigste jobben dere gjør på lab?
Yeah, I think that's a very difficult thing to answer.
Ja, det skjønner jeg.
And I think especially for my embryologists, because I'm very sort of attention detailed, I feel that every job is important because everything is connected. So, for example, preparation of dishes, that might be considered a very easy job, but that has huge implications in terms of how those eggs are going to be fertilized and also how the embryo is going to develop. If you do that wrong, then you're going to impact everything else down there. And then there's other things. So, for example, the egg seed, when we take the sperm injected, selecting the best possible sperm, doing everything at the right time points. So I don't feel that there's a singular job that is more important than everything else. Everything should be perfect all the way through. Otherwise you will have issues further down the line.
Det jo egentlig det svaret jeg hadde forventet å få.
Yeah, sorry.
Nei, det ikke noe å si sorry for. Det jo nettopp det at det her jo flere steg på veien som har påvirkning på det neste steget. Så, ja. Men det jo det noen sårbare faser da, under prosessen som ekstra mer sårbar?
I would say it's the sort of embryo development stage. The reason for this is it kind of gives us indication of how the cycle is going to go. Okay?
Yeah.
And also the embryos are very, very vulnerable at this stage. When we put them in the incubator, they are reliant on us looking after them. So for me, I always think the first division, so when an egg goes from 1 cell to 2 cell, that for me is the most sort of vulnerable stage. Because if the egg doesn't divide properly at that stage, it's very unlikely that it's going to get to the next stage of development. So for me, that is the sort of key area where things can go wrong. There are other areas, such as with fertilization, that I think with our lab in particular, we are quite good at fertilization. So I'm not particularly worried about that. But it can happen that you might not get fertilization at that stage.
Det interessant. Vi skal gå over litt nå, fordi at jeg har en del spørsmål til deg, som knyttet til litt sånn faglig, mer, ja, det jo som jeg nevner helt i starten, ganske mange som har mye spørsmål rundt akkurat den delen av behandlingen, for det jo der man føler man selv har minst kontroll i hvert fall.
Ja.
Og det jo forståelig. Så da tenkte jeg liksom at vi skulle nå få gått gjennom noen spørsmål, og så tror jeg og håper at det vil være til god nytte da, til dem som hører på.
Yeah.
Og tenk liksom I starten har prøvd liksom å skulle dele det opp sånn at det blir forståelig og litt sånn naturlig for dem som hører på hvilke bolker vi setter spørsmålene I også.
Mhm.
Det starter liksom med egg og embryoutvikling, kvalitet, utvelgelse, for det jo en stor del av jobben deres.
Mm.
Og du var jo inne på det her med altså befruktning.
Mm.
Mm.
Yeah.
Hva grunnen til at egg ikke blir befruktet, og skjer det ofte? Det noen ting å gjøre med det?
Yeah. Yeah. I think when it comes to eggs not being fertilized, there's a lot of different things that can happen along the way.
Mm.
The most common is that the egg was not mature enough for the sperm to get in. So when we look at eggs, there's 3 different phases of maturity. There's very early, which we call a GV, middle part, which is an M1, and then our final mature egg is an M2. When an egg gets to that stage, then it is ready to get an egg. Get a sperm. So when we look at fertilization the next day after IVF, it is possible that the low fertilization rate is due to those eggs not being at the right stage of maturity for that sperm to come in. That is probably the most common that we see in a sense. The other factors could be sperm. So you can have situations where everything looks perfect in the sperm sample. You add the right number of sperm, but then the fertilization is low. And in those cases, it could be that the sperm are not strong enough to get into the egg. They may be unable to bind to the egg, or they might not be able to activate the egg to make it fertilized. And those are quite difficult cases in that sense. One way of kind of overcoming that is that if that does happen in an IVF cycle, then to try and evaluate the next treatment cycle. So instead of doing IVF, potentially doing ICSI, where we just take the sperm and put it in, and that can overcome some of the problems with fertilization. So there can be different factors, and there are also different solutions for each of those problems, because we talked about the immaturity or the maturity of the eggs. Sometimes it's just about altering a little bit with the stimulation or giving extra medicine that can improve the number of mature oocytes at the time. So there's always usually a possibility to change these outcomes.
Veldig ryddig og veldig sånn greit å forstå, synes
Yeah,
jeg.
good.
Og
Go ahead.
det å vite, det å vite, fordi det å vite at det kan jo være sånn at hvis man har prøvd på egen hånd og ikke blitt gravid, og så gjør man en fertilitetssjekk, og ting skjer, sånn som du sier, skjer I utgangspunktet normalt ut, og så får man lite eller ingen befruktning gjennom en IVF, så kan jo også det være en forklaring til hvorfor man ikke har blitt gravid naturlig også.
Yeah, absolutely. But I think the thing is, especially when it comes to fertilization, because it is the first step in the process, if that goes wrong, then it's a massive implication to the couple, because they've been stopped straight away. They're not carrying on any further. So it is very difficult to do that. But I think one of the things when we have that situation, especially on a lab's point of view, is to evaluate the situation very, very carefully. So checking that the sperm concentration was correct when you added it in, making sure that you do have sperm alive in the dish the next day, and also to see if there is sperm attached to the egg. Okay, this gives us better indication, and then we can make a plan for the next time. So hopefully that will not happen again, because it is very distressing when you have to give a call of no fertilization.
Ja. Og det jo både vondt å gi beskjeden, og det å motta en beskjed. Jeg har jo samtaler med noen av parene som dessverre opplever det, og det jo et forventningsbrudd som man forventer ikke at prosessen skal stoppe så raskt, sånn at det blir en veldig sånn skummel situasjon å stå i, for det kommer masse nye spørsmål, og det blir veldig stressrelatert, altså.
It's something that I think a lot of people may not think about, that they're not going to get fertilization at the very first stage. So that can be really, really distressing. When it comes to this as well, I do feel that it is important to talk about this as well before treatment, and to see, okay, this can happen in the process, and prepare yourself, but hopefully it won't. And it doesn't happen very often. So I think in our cases, it maybe happens about 3% of cases in a year out of 700 or more transfers, or egg collections. So it is very, very rare for that to happen.
Og det jo viktig å påpeke at det sjeldent at det skjer, men alt av forberedelse jo nyttig hvis man skulle oppleve det. Og så det jo ikke for å skremme noen, fordi de fleste vil jo oppleve å få befruktet egg etter et egguttak.
Absolutely, yeah.
Når vi har fått befruktet eggene, så det jo så embryoutvikling. Du sa jo noe i sted om at helt i starten det litt sånn sårbar fase. Kan du snakke litt, eller fortelle oss litt om kvalitet og klassifisering av embryo, for det nok mange som litt nysgjerrig på det også.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think if we just look at the sort of embryos itself, so once it's divided, the sort of classification on quality and grading depends on different time points at which that embryo has developed. So for example, on a day 2 embryo, what we're looking for is that the embryo has divided normally from 1 cell to 2 cell, and then 2 cell to 4 cell. So we should have 4 cells on day 2. The other thing that we will look at is something called fragmentation. And I think the best way of describing this is like if you take a biscuit and you break it, the crumbs that come off of the biscuit are fragmentation in an embryo. So it's little parts of the embryo that they've spat out. The less of the fragmentation you have, the better the quality of embryo. Okay? So we've got 4 cells, less fragmentation, good quality embryo. The other thing that we look at in Oslo is we look for what's called multinucleation. And this is it sounds like a very big word, but what it means is that each of the cells has 1 copy of genetic material. So in the cell, we have the cell, and then we have a little circle that tells us that there's genetic material in there. In embryos that have multiple copies of genetic material, they often have a poorer outcome. Okay, so even though you have a 4-cell embryo with very few fragmentation, but you have this sort of multinucleation, we would then say that this is a poorer quality embryo out of that. And we wouldn't throw anything away. That is not what we do in the lab. We always give embryos a chance to see how they develop. After that, then we go into the sort of day 3s, and it's the same sort of classification, but at this stage we're looking for 8 cells or more compared to the 4 cells, same fragmentation and multinucleation, and also how that embryo has got to the 8-cell stage, that every cell has divided once. After that, it's day 4, and day 4 grading, it's a very interesting sort of grading thing, because the embryo doesn't look like much. So at that stage, all the cells have come together, and it forms a blob. It's called a morula. So you can't see the cells, it's just a blob of material at that stage. But what we're looking for is, one, that all the cells have come together, so they formed a nice tight ball, that there's no sort of fragmentation or cells that have been excluded from that, because they could be abnormal. And what we really want to see on day 4 is maybe the very, very start of the embryo turning into a day 5 embryo. So we call this cavitation, where the morula starts to fill with fluid, and that's exactly what we want. That would be classified as a good quality embryo. And then the most beautiful, in my opinion, of all the embryos is day 5. So this is the stage we call blastocyst. So this is when the embryo has decided what cells are going to form the baby, and what cells are going to support the pregnancy through the
Det
placenta.
helt sykt egentlig, vet
Yeah,
du.
it's
Ja.
amazing to watch, and you can see when the embryo develops how it kind of moves the cells around in the embryo. So it's fascinating to watch.
Ja,
But
det
what
det
we're looking
faktisk.
for at this stage is that the embryo has expanded, and we grade this on a classification from 1 to 5, sometimes even 6. And this means how big the embryo has gotten. So on day 5, we would expect maybe a 4 category. So we've got a nice big embryo. Or a 5, the embryo started to come out of its shell. Or a 6, so the embryo has fully come out of its shell.
Ja.
And then we grade the cells are going to form the baby from A to C. And A is the best, meaning that there's a lot of cells, the cells look healthy, they're forming a nice clump ball there. And then we grade the cells that support the pregnancy, once again from A to C. So A means that there's a lot of very good cells. It kind of looks like bubble wrap, if that makes any sense.
Ja.
Around the embryo, yeah?
Ja.
So
Ja.
lovely little like dimples all the way around the embryo.
Ja.
So when a lot of people get worried about grading as well on day 5. So I can say that grading is very subjective. So one embryologist and one clinic may give an embryo a different grade from what we might give them. Okay? And this is dependent on what we see down the microscope. So if you have been told that your embryo is, for example, a 4AB, which is still a good quality embryo, it doesn't mean that it's necessarily a poor embryo, okay?
No.
Or even a 4BB, because what we need to remember is that embryos continue to develop. So if you have fewer cells there, maybe there's going to be more and more as it continues to develop. So not to be too worried about the sort of classification.
Det tror jeg er viktig at du påpeker, fordi mange kan jo bli veldig opptatt av kvalifiseringa på, eller klassifiseringa på embryoene sine. Forståelig nok. Forstår jo det veldig godt. Men det er jo også viktig å si at, i hvert fall, vi kan jo snakke for oss selv, men sånn som både embryo som vi bruker til å sette tilbake i ferskforsøk, og embryo som vi fryser ned og bruker til fryseforsøk, er jo ganske strengt scoring på, sånn at alt som brukes har jo en sjanse til å bli barn.
Absolutely. We would never freeze an embryo down or put an embryo back if we did not feel it had a good chance of creating a live, healthy pregnancy.
Nei, og det er jo kjempeviktig. Det er litt sånn som man kan huske på, og så er det nyanser her selvfølgelig som man kanskje ikke nødvendigvis trenger å henge seg for mye opp i da. Når dere da ser på de embryoene her i utviklingen, hva kan være grunnen til at et embryo stopper? Er det da du var jo inne på fragmentering og celledeling, men hva kan være grunnen? Hva er årsaken til at et embryo stopper liksom å utvikle seg?
Yeah, so like everything in embryology, there's multiple reasons. But if we take the sort of common cause of embryos not developing further, it's most likely a genetic issue with that embryo. So when embryos divide, there's very specific checkpoints that embryo has to overcome so that it says that this is good enough to make another cell. And sometimes those checkpoints aren't met, right? So an embryo can stop at a certain stage. And that's most likely the most common, I feel, what we see in the lab. Sometimes there can be other factors. So for example, most of the embryos that you expect to stop will be from day 3 to day 4. And this is a very important time for the embryo. So this is where the embryo starts to activate the whole of its genome, not just being part of one set. So the sperm comes into play at this point. So if there's a problem on one side, then it can prevent the embryo from going further. Also, which I hope doesn't happen that often, is actually lab conditions. So we have a huge part to play in how embryos develop outside the genetics. So, for example, if the conditions are not right, so if the gases are not right, the culture environment's pH is not right, the air quality is not right in the lab, that can all prevent the embryo from getting to a certain point. So that can happen as well. And when it comes to those sort of external factors from the lab, it's very important that we have these sort of checkpoints and proper SOPs in place to prevent that from happening. But that can be a possibility.
Du nevnte jo litt grann om det, hvis et embryo stopper tidlig, si fra dag etter det har blitt befruktet, og frem til dag 3, eller om det stopper fra dag 3 til dag 5, er det en ulik forklaring?
They can be. So it is quite difficult most of the time to try and dissect what is the main cause of that embryo not getting to a certain point. But what I often see in the lab is, especially those embryos that are going from or stopping on day 3 to day 4, what will typically happen is that either the embryo completely stops, okay, so that could just be a very large genetic issue with that embryo, or you start to get what's called as vacuoles. And this is like little holes in the embryo that just get bigger and bigger and bigger and start to destroy the cells. Now, this could potentially be maybe a sperm factor. So this is where the sperm comes into play, that it is just not the right genetic material to continue the development. Or there could be, like I said, something wrong with the culture conditions that is preventing that embryo from going further. So if I have a patient or a couple that come in and all the embryos stop before day 3, I would say that there's maybe something going on either in the lab or there's a genetic issue. Embryos that sort of stop later on, then I'd kind of look more towards the man's side. So is the sperm, how is the sperm quality in terms of its DNA? Like, do they need to have a DNA fragmentation test to see if that will improve the outcome?
Har et embryo som utvikler seg dårlig muligheten til å rette seg opp igjen? Det er liksom,
So Maria, one of the embryologists here, she calls them phoenix embryos because they rise from the ashes. It is completely possible that you have an embryo that does not look good early on, that corrects itself later on in its development, and then you can have this beautiful embryo on day 5. So it is completely possible. And then conversely, you would have the opposite, very, very beautiful embryos that just don't get to day 5, or they don't form good quality embryos on day 5. So it is possible. And in those cases, it's very, very difficult to relay information to couples because we are not sure if that embryo is going to get to the point where we can transfer it or freeze it. So it is very difficult. And sometimes we get surprised in the morning when we come in, and sometimes it is what we expect.
Jeg skjønner. Kan du se også for eksempel hvis man har vi har et par til behandling, og så henter ut egg, og så blir det dårlig embryoutvikling. Det blir ingen å sette tilbake, eller det blir ikke gode embryoer av det. Kan man se at paret kommer inn til en ny runde senere, på et senere tidspunkt, og få et bedre resultat? Er det håp, selv om man får en syklus som på en måte gir veldig dårlig embryokvalitet, er det likevel håp om å kunne kanskje få en annen syklus som avgir bedre resultat da?
Absolutely. So we've had a few cases like this, where maybe the first cycle will be good and they hope they have a child, and they do sometimes. Then they want to come in again and it's a bad cycle, and then everything is cancelled. Then they come in a month later and it's a great cycle. So every cycle can be different. I would never say that if you have a bad cycle, it means that all your cycles are going to be bad. Okay? There's different things that play part in how those eggs and sperm are developing, and that is changing all the time. So don't always rely on the results of one cycle for the results of a second cycle.
Nei. Det er viktig. Det er jo flere som leser litt om kromosomer.
Ja.
Genetisk arvemateriale, hvor viktig og avgjørende det er for at et embryo skal utvikle seg videre i livmor og bli til et foster og baby og på en måte gå hele veien da. Kan dere se noe av det her ut ifra vurderingene som dere gjør på lab?
Yeah, not 100%.
Nei.
So we can have indications that potentially the embryo is genetically abnormal, and this is what we were talking about earlier by looking at this multinucleation.
Yes.
So in those cases, it is possible that that embryo is genetically abnormal, okay? But it doesn't always mean that, for example, it is, because even having one multinucleated cell doesn't mean that the embryo is going to be completely affected with that. Well, there's a high chance it is going to be, but we don't know for sure. So the only thing that we can do is continue that embryo as development and then just monitor it as it goes throughout the cycle, throughout the time it's with us. In a lot of cases, as I mentioned, if the embryo is heavily multinucleated, it's very rare that we get a good quality embryo on day 5.
Yeah.
Okay? And if we do see embryos that do have multinucleation, that reach a stage of very high quality blastocysts, but there are other embryos that haven't been affected, we do typically freeze that down, but we mark it as a last thaw. So this is a very, very last embryo that we would. And the reason for that is that we cannot be 100% sure that that embryo will not result in a pregnancy.
Skjønner. Ja. Kan, bare sånn for moro skyld, kan dere se på embryoene om de er i ferd med å utvikle seg til enegga tvillinger?
If it's going to become twins?
Ja.
Yeah. So usually not. But there is a very rare instance where sometimes in day 5 embryos, and this happens very, very rarely, that instead of that one part that we call inner cell mass is going to make the baby, we have 2. So we might have one on either side, and in that case, there is a higher chance of having twins with that. And the patient should always be counseled about this before putting back the embryo.
Skjønner.
Like I said, typically not. But we do know that in certain cycles, especially frozen cycles, there can be a higher rate of twinning. And the reason for this is when you freeze down embryos, that shell that is around them that's protecting the embryo, that becomes slightly harder. So when the embryo tries to hatch out of that, sometimes you can get splitting of that embryo. So you can have 2 parts coming out at different times, which can result in twins.
Yeah.
So there is a higher rate with twinning with frozen cycles over fresh, but it's not absolute. I'm not saying that everyone is going to have a frozen cycle that's going to end up with twins, but that's not the case. But it is slightly higher.
Ja. Når du er inne på jeg var bare litt nysgjerrig på det, om man kan faktisk kunne se det eller ikke, men det er jo, som du sier, ikke så veldig ofte da.
No.
Men du nevner jo fryseforsøk også. Jeg tenkte vi skulle bevege oss over på det og høre litt, hva er sjansene for at et embryo ikke overlever opptinning i et fryseforsøk?
Yeah, so this depends on the type of freezing method that you use. So in the sort of old days, I'm going to say old days, but this is also when I started being an embryologist. We used a method called slow freezing.
Den husker jeg.
Yeah, I remember the machine waiting for 3 hours to freeze. But in this case, slow freezing typically has a higher rate of embryos not surviving. So you would typically expect around about 60% of those embryos to survive.
Mm.
We've moved on since then. So the freezing method has got a lot better with different technology, and we use a system called vitrification. And in this case, it's very, very rare that an embryo will not survive the freezing and thawing process. So you should be expecting at least 98% survival rate per thaw.
Ja. Det er jo veldig sånn, jeg tenker alt som kan ryddes litt bort av bekymring, er jo viktig. Det er jo klart at hele veien så kan vi jo aldri garantere, men det er jo veldig, veldig stor sannsynlighet for at embryo som er fryst også blir en transfer av, da.
Absolutely. I
Ja.
think people who do have embryos frozen or are thinking about starting a cycle that could potentially have frozen embryos is always ask the lab that you're going to, the clinic that you're going to, and specifically ask the lab, what is their survival rate for frozen embryo transfers? This is very important information for the patients.
Klart det er det. Hva kan være, du nevnte jo egentlig litt om det, jeg vet ikke om det er noen andre grunner i forbindelse med hvilke fryse-tine-teknikker du bruker på lab, men er det noen andre grunner til at et embryo på dag 5-6 ikke, at det ikke overlever, men det var egentlig ikke det jeg skulle spørre om. Det jeg skulle spørre om var, hva er grunnen til at et embryo på dag 5-6 ikke kan fryses? At det faktisk ikke kvalifiseres til å fryses ned?
So this is typically based on the grading that we give it. And that grading, as we talked about, is based on the number of cells for that embryo on day 5 or day 6. So embryos that have very, very poor quality, so those are your C's and your D's, they do not have enough cells around to support the pregnancy. And in certain cases, some of those cells, especially the ones that are going to form the baby, that is missing. So if we see that, then we don't freeze down the embryo. Also, if the embryo is dying on day 5, now that's a very strong word, but we see that embryos do struggle sometimes, and also they start to turn what we call black or blackened at this stage. Those embryos are probably not going to survive the freezing thawing process, and they're most likely not going to result in a pregnancy. Okay. The other thing is if that embryo has not reached day 5 or a blastocyst stage at the right time point, then we wouldn't freeze it down. We do have cases where on day 5 we don't have blastocysts, so we don't have day 5 embryos, but they're still going, right? So we can't freeze them on day 5, but we give them an extra day. And in that case, when we usually come in the morning, then we have a cohort of potentially embryos that we can freeze down of good quality.
Så pasienten kan i noen tilfeller få beskjed om på dag 5 at man avventer og ser en dag til om vi kan fryse ned embryo eller ikke.
Yeah, absolutely. Sometimes embryos just need a little bit of time. It's like with a human being.
Jo alle sammen.
Sometimes, some people are just a little bit slower. Perfectly fine.
Ja da. Når vi snakker om fryseforsøk og sånn, hvordan er det dere gjør den prosessen på labben? Hva skjer når dere, hva gjør dere?
So the whole freezing procedure, what we're basically trying to do is that we're trying to remove water from the embryo. Once we've got to that stage, and this is very tightly controlled in terms of timing, we place the embryo on a small straw and we put that into liquid nitrogen. So we're taking the embryo, in our case, from 37 degrees Celsius down to minus 190 something degrees Celsius very, very quickly, right? And what happens is that embryo turns to almost like glass. It's like a crystal. So it's frozen in time at that point. And that is the safest place for that embryo to be in the cryo storage section. So then that will go into our storage tank and can stay there for, in theory, as long as possible. But we obviously have rules and regulations in Norway that you need to use your embryos by the age of 46.
Ja.
So the embryos can stay there for 10 years, etc. And if it is proper management of the cryo system, that embryo should be exactly the same when you take it out and thaw it
Skjønner.
again.
Så om du setter tilbake et embryo etter 1 år, hvor embryo har vært nedfryst i 1 år eller 10 år, så embryoets kvalitet det samme?
Yes, it should be the same. Because as I mentioned, you're freezing it in time. So I always find this very interesting to think about, that we do have couples that have come in and had a fresh cycle and have fallen pregnant and had a child. But in that fresh cycle, that child's siblings have been frozen down at exactly the same time. And then when they come in 2 years' time to have the transfer, technically both those embryos are the exact same age because of when they were made, but one is 2 years older than the other when they are born.
Og det veldig merkelig å tenke på.
Yeah, it's insane. It's
At den
crazy.
ene har vært fryst, liksom.
Kept in time.
Ja, det veldig merkelig, altså. Vi begynner å bevege oss mot slutten, men jeg merker jo at når vi sitter og prater, så det flere tema som jeg garantert kommer til å spørre deg om vi kan snakke om, og det både, vi har jo ikke nevnt så mye om eggfrys, det tenker jeg at det også kan være veldig interessant å få prate om, og ikke minst den ekspertisen som du har rundt spermkvalitet, altså sædkvalitet og rundt, altså tematikken der. Så det tror jeg vi skal ta mer om litt senere. Men sånn helt til slutt, viktig for meg som pasient da, å vite, det noen risiko for at feil egg og sperm blir forvekslet med noen andres i forbindelse med IVF-behandling?
Yeah, that's everyone's worst nightmare, even in the lab. I think it'd be wrong for me to say that there's absolutely no risk, okay? Because that is not the case. There's always a risk. However, that risk is incredibly small, depending on the type of security steps you have in place within the lab, right? So, for example, we use a system called RI Witness, which means that every single sperm, egg, and embryo is monitored through its entire process. So it's almost impossible to mix up sperm and eggs, right? If we were to put down a dish with another person's embryos in it for transfer, the whole system would alarm, and it's actually a very scary thing when that does happen, right? Because on it, you don't know what to do. You just panic, you take the embryos back, and you put them back, right? But that is a good thing, right? Because you have saved that situation, right? So with certain management systems, such as the RI Witness, and there's other ones like Matcher, etc., depending on the clinic that you use, the risk is incredibly, incredibly small. Okay, but it's always something that's good when you are looking for a clinic to ask them what sort of procedures do you have in place to secure traceability of those eggs, embryos, and sperm to make sure that does not happen. Okay, and I think as the field has improved over the years, I think those sort of mismatches have decreased. Okay, so it is incredibly small, depending on what sort of system you have in place.
Hva har egentlig labben, hvilken rolle spiller egentlig labben for meg som pasient? Du har jo nevnt at det jo litt forskjeller, man gjør det jo ulikt fra lab til lab, og vi skal jo fokusere på vår lab, og skal ikke på en måte snakke noen andre ned i det hele tatt, eller noe sånt, men jeg tenker litt sånn, det her jo for pasienter, og for dem som står i situasjonen, hva liksom, hvilken rolle spiller labben for meg?
Yeah, I think it's the connection. I think the connection between the couple or the person and the lab, right? I think it's very important that you have a good dialogue with the
Ja.
people who are looking after your precious eggs, embryos, and sperm, so that you know and you can trust them, and also just have someone to talk to during the process. I mean, the one part of our job is actually talking to people and just hearing their worries and their concerns, and also supporting them along the process. And as a patient, if I was a patient for a clinic, I would want that good connection with the lab, for someone that I can talk to maybe just express some of the feelings that I have at that moment, and also to talk about what to do next, or like what do you feel as an embryologist could be done in the next cycle. I think that's really important, to have that good connection.
Det så mange fine og gode svar. Jeg føler jo på en måte at jeg har jo snakket med deg i så mange år, så jeg føler jo liksom at jeg har vært med på reisen og utviklingen på labben vi har hatt også. Jeg også lærer jo masse av det her. Så vi skal begynne å runde av. Det noe du har lyst til å si?
I mean, there's so much that that's the problem. But I think one of the most important things is get to know your embryologist. Get to know the lab team. Okay? I mean, as embryologists, we're kind of locked away in a room all the time. We never see anyone per se. But we know who you are, and we care about you. And it's important that we have a good communication. And yeah, I think it's always just about just talking, right? And expressing your concerns. That's me.
Men det synes jeg var veldig fint, akkurat det du sier der med at kanskje ikke du som pasient har sett oss like mye, men vi vet veldig godt hvem du da. Og at vi bryr oss.
Like, we do have that connection between what is happening, and yes, we speak to you on the phone, and it's good to have that, but just so people know that what is happening in the lab it's a sort of an environment of real care and determination and hope as well. It's not just a black box that we put in the eggs and sperm at one end and to chuck out embryos the other one. It's not that at all.
Nei. Det synes jeg du har fått frem helt utmerket i dag da, Steven.
Yeah, good.
Ja,
good.
Veldig, veldig bra. Ok, da vil jeg bare si tusen hjertelig takk for at du hadde lyst til å bruke tida di med meg, og ikke minst gi av din tid til dem som lytter.
Thank you for having me, Mari.
Ja, det blir ikke siste gangen.
No, I'm glad. I'd love to talk more.
Så må du ha en fantastisk dag videre. Det jo masse å gjøre i Oslo, så tusen takk for at du ble med i dag.
Chat soon. Bye.
Gjør det. Ha det, ha det. Tusen takk til deg som hørte på. Jeg håper virkelig at episoden har vært til nytte for deg, og hvis du som sagt har noen ønsker om tematikk du vil vi skal ta opp, så ta kontakt med meg. Hvis du i et parforhold eller single og ønsker å ta en uforpliktende prat med oss vedrørende fertilitet og barneønske, så vit at vi her. På gjensyn.
MedicusPodden.
Nå du endelig gravid.
Hva gjør dere på par til par?
Takk skal du søke.
Velkommen til MedicusPodden.